I grew up with photography because both my grandfather and my father were photographers. Nonetheless, I resisted becoming a photographer myself until I left school because art photography, such as I was interested in, was not what we did in my family. My father is an advertising photographer. You mustn't forget that in the 1970s, photography was not considered, in Germany at least, an art. In other words, those who took an interest in photography at the time could not work on the basis that the more they developed their technique and knowledge of photography, the likelier it would become that they would be successful in the art world. We thought that we had to interpret reality in order to develop any kind of artistic expression. When I began studying in Düsseldorf, I concentrated on architectural photography, but I couldn't see much of a future for myself. It was only after about 2 or 3 years that I began to devote myself to landscapes. At the time, I spent all my time driving around Düsseldorf and the Ruhr Valley, taking photos of landscapes. The whole point of these images was less the representation of a landscape or of the people in the photo, and more the manner and style in which I photographed the people within the landscape. In other words, I always kept my distance, so much so that at first sight, it's not obvious that there are people in the landscape. To get to university in Essen, I had to cross this bridge, so I knew it very well. And maybe on the 10th time, I was standing in front of the bridge. This person appeared quite by chance. I immediately understood that he was the dot that was missing on the eye of the picture. What particularly interests me about this photo is that it is almost certainly a functional and technocratic 1970s building. The clothes they're wearing show that these are 70s, early 80s students, but their posture and their activities could be those of young men in the 18th century. Normally, I try to avoid people who stick out of a crowd or who look at the camera. I prefer to focus on the group. This is another of my early photos, when the story of photo told was very important to me. If I found myself somewhere like this nowadays, I'd probably lose the cable car and would just concentrate on the landscape. I have already said that for the period 1984, 1988, 89, I always leave them in their original format because I want them to preserve their authentic context. Nowadays, it's different. I hardly work with small formats anymore. What I mean is that I've got certain habits, and I definitely choose subjects that lend themselves to larger formats. In this photo, it struck me as truly absurd that people should go to relax at the seaside and totally ignore the sea. Generally, when I take a shot from a high angle, I try not to eliminate the horizon, because if I arbitrarily cut an image on every side, as I did here, the result is second rate, because it leaves an overly subjective extract of an image. This is the exception that proves the rule. So it can be done, but in general, I try not to cut out the horizon because it makes the image seem too compact. Bert Brecht said that photography can no longer recreate the reality of a factory because reality, as such, has drifted into the functional. If I select 5 factories out of 100 or so, it is because I have a very precise idea of what I'm looking for. I only allow reality to influence me in very particular circumstances. Either I have a very precise picture of the modern factory, or I fall back on an image that is universally valid. Seeing as I wanted to show the whole of the building, I was forced to find 2 different places to shoot from, one on the right and one on the left. I wanted to make sure, in other words, that the point of view was equal opposite each window. I don't think it's chance that made me choose this building. Of course, for me, it was the ideal location, because it is the representation of the encyclopedia of life. When you look at the original shot, there are millions of different objects to see. Of course, I believe that images like this one express something about the state of society. You can certainly discern the obsession with consumer goods that is predominant in society. My first digital image dates back to 1992. It was a photo I took at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. There were certain intrusive details that would, in the end, have stopped me from using the image. And then I decided to replace them with other details that I found more interesting. That's not to say that I touch up all my photos digitally. A great many of them are still produced by conventional means and are never retouched, and when it comes down to it, it is impossible to say which have been touched up and which haven't. What matters in the final analysis is the image as it stands and not how it was produced. This photo is the result of a lot of hard work. On my first visit to the Parliament building, I shot at night, which, because of the darkness, meant there were no reflections of the outside. As a result, I set up a date to return and take some shots in the daytime. This time, you could hardly see anything because the reflections in the windows made it difficult to make out what was going on inside. So we kind of improvised the situation using daylight and mirrors on the middle part of the photo. So, to sum up, the architecture of the photo, the horizontal and vertical structures, come from one shot. The lower section and what's on the left of the photo were shot in the daytime. The upper section with the visitor's terrace was shot at night. I got this result with the help of a computer, otherwise you wouldn't be able to make anything out. I took this picture bearing in mind the way it would be exhibited. For example, I produced this image by combing several times over the Hong Kong-Shanghai Bank. A totally different subject. A solid subject. And so, you can look at this microscopically and macroscopically. From a microscopic point of view, you can see what's going on inside the building, the people, what they're doing. If you look at it macroscopically, it seems full of accessories. That means that you can approach an image at many different levels. For example, if you look closely at this image, you realize that it is in fact a road. You can see the tire marks. That is very important for me. Although there are no people in the landscapes, you can discern, most of the time, traces of people within the landscape. I feel a bit like a recording device, expressing the spirit of the time in my own particular way. This return to aesthetic forms that have stood the test of time is, in my opinion, widespread in art today.